All righty then. Thank you, PJ, and welcome everyone. I take it that most people are every bit as unfamiliar with Zoom as I am, so if I have to slow down or back up because I did something incorrect, I hope you'll bear with me. Today, being the 15th of May, is actually completely coincidental, but this is the date that my ancestors would have said is the earliest date to plant summer vegetables here in the Tennessee Valley, May the 15th. So today we're going to talk about the warm season vegetables and that do very well here, and how to go about growing them. We'll be covering beans, which actually can be planted a little earlier than now, but for best results, they like nice warm soil. So we'll be talking about beans, the cucurbit family, okra, pardon me, cucumbers and squashes, okra, sweet corn, tomatoes, peppers, and sweet potatoes. These are all some of the best and most productive summer vegetables that you can grow, and they are all fairly easy to preserve so that you can grow them in a fairly large quantity. I'm going to share a screen now if I can get this slide up here. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing. PJ, can you fix that?
Hang on, let me see. Geez.
If not, I'll just use it as an outline, and I can just keep going without sharing the screen.
Try it again, John. Okay. I apologize.
There we go. It says that
there it is.
You see the outline there?
Yes, sure do.
Okay. Then, so when we talk warm season vegetables, first thing we have to take in mind is the frost freeze dates. I would say a lot of people just take it as a rule of thumb that the frost free date here in the spring is April the 15th, but we know from this year that that is not a hard and fast rule. We had some frost just last week, so about 3 weeks later than April the 15th. And the reason for that is that the frost and freeze dates are as probabilities. It's based on the probability that a frost will occur on any particular date. So April the 15th happens to be the 50% probability. In other words, the frost is just as likely as it isn't. You have a 50-50 chance of having a frost on April 15th. And if you want a better deal than that, a frost on May 5th, there is only a 10% chance that we'll have a frost after May the 5th. Anyhow, despite that, all of the wise old folks here whose gardening really counted, it made a big difference to them in terms of their food supply, said wait until after May the 15th to put out your tomato plants and so forth. So that's the reason we're going to talk about these warm season things. planning is just as important in the summer garden, and I hope that you will take some time and make a plan for your uh, summer garden layout, taking into account how many uh, plants of each variety that you intend to plant and where they're going to go. Remember that the summer vegetables, by and large, these are fruiting crops. We eat the plants, the part of the plant that's botanically the fruit. So it takes a lot of energy and to do that, and the plants also need good fertile soil. I'm gonna see if I can get a better looking screen for you there.
There you go. That's it, John.
There we go. Now, some of these things you can grow in containers, and that can allow you to stretch the season, because if there's a frost threatened, you can move the container inside temporarily. However, I will have to say I've been growing some things in containers, some vegetables in containers now for the last 2 or 3 years. It gets to be a real issue in the summertime when our temperatures are pushing 100 degrees. Containers actually need to be watered maybe as often as 3 times a day. And if that's the case, all that water going through there removes all of the soluble nutrients from the growing medium. And that ends up meaning that you have to be adding fertilizer. It can get to the point where you feel like you're doing hydroponics. So while I think containers can be useful during the cooler parts of the year, you want to really think about that in the summertime. Also, temperatures above about 85 degrees can cause pollination to fail, both in cucurbits and in tomatoes. So that's something to bear in mind. If you think about frost protection for the end of the season, you can generally stretch your summer harvest as long as a month if you can arrange to protect late summer crops from frost. So that's something worth thinking about in your garden plan. Several of these summer crops, in particular cucumbers and tomatoes, are going to require support. Trellis of some kind or tomato cages, something like that. I'm a fan of using 6x6 nylon mesh netting supported on poles for cucumber trellis. But whatever you use, you want to make sure that it will support the crop, the plant, when it's cropping, because fruits, generally speaking, are mostly water and are quite heavy, and you want the trellis to be sturdy enough so that it won't collapse when it's hanging full of tomatoes or cucumbers or winter squash or whatever. Also, remember that you can utilize companion and succession planning when you're doing your summer vegetables. For example, beans can be successfully intercropped with almost any of the other vegetables, and we know many of us here know about the Native American Three Sisters planting method, where corn and beans and squash are all planted together. So those kinds of things can be done to help maximize the productivity of your space. Also remember, you're going to need lots and lots of water. Vegetables require 1 inch of water a week. And as we were saying, vegetables in containers and in raised beds will take more water than those being grown in the ground. And the last thing you want to have to do when it's 85 degrees is lug water in buckets or a watering can. So try to be where you're in reach of a hose. And you're going to need some minimal tools, and you'll need storage for those. So kind of keep all of that in mind when you're planning. If this is your first effort at vegetable gardening, keep all of those points in mind when you're making a plan. Many of the summer garden plants you can get a jump start on the season, an earlier harvest, by using plants that have been started indoors earlier than you would normally be able to put them outside. Those would be starts or transplants. And the other option is direct seeding, where you put the seeds in the ground. That involves no root disturbance for transplanting, and that's the best thing to do for root vegetables. And in the summer, legumes like beans, lima beans, regular snap beans, filet beans, and so forth. Seed is much cheaper than started plants. In the case of small seeded vegetables, they have to be thinned. Beets, for example, have to be thinned, but beans, the seeds are large enough to usually you can space them properly without worrying about thinning. The biggest issue I would say for home gardeners starting seeds is the loss that you will suffer to pests such as cutworms or slugs or things of that nature that will feed on tender seedlings. Groundhogs can be a problem. I have had an entire row of okra clipped off about a ½ inch above the soil line when they were just about 3 inches tall by hungry groundhogs. So that's can be a problem with starts, but it's more often a problem with the tender seedlings. It's important, if you're not going to start your own seeds at home to grow your own transplants, it's very important to make sure that the transplants that you buy are themselves strong and healthy. You want stocky plants with relatively short inner nodes, meaning the space, if you're talking about tomatoes, for example, the distance between each main leaf on the stem, they shouldn't be long and stretched out. You also shouldn't have large amounts of roots protruding out the bottom of the pot, because that shows the plant's been in there too long. There's less of a chance of loss when you start with transplants, and if you use transplants, that's ideal for designing the type of garden that you had in mind, because you can very accurately place plants and better visualize how they're going to look when they're mature. As I said, you can buy them or grow them yourself, and I've recently had a discussion about this. I've talked to several people that were complaining last week about having to cover up their tomato plants because they had already planted tomato plants. And I said, well, the problem is you plant them too early. And he said, but if I wait until after May the 15th, and when I go to the garden center, they won't have the plants that I want at the garden center. And if I get them in April, by the time May 15th gets here, I'm already tired of carrying them in and out and in and out and in and out. So I just go ahead and put them down. So it's fairly common that the local garden centers have tomato and pepper plants much earlier than they really should have for here. And if therefore you can grow them yourself, that's the way you want to do it, because of course you can choose what varieties to grow. You can grow varieties that aren't otherwise available, and so on. Starting your own plants at home, though, is a whole nother set of subjects. So we're going to later assume, when we're talking about transplants, that you've got your hands on them some way, and we're not going to really go into the specifics of how to start these individual transplants. All of these warm season crops have basically the same requirements. And the first one I have listed here, requiring warm soil and warm air. The soil temperature is more important than the air temperature. Ideally, the soil temperature needs to be above 55 degrees. And for cucurbits, it would be better if it was above 60 degrees when you put the roots in the ground. And they do need warm air temperatures up to a point. None of these things will tolerate frost, but on the other hand, they don't really grow well when the temperature is starting to head above 85 and 90 degrees. They don't really like okra and peppers, I guess, like heat better than any of these others. Leafy crops and root crops here in Tennessee Valley do much better if they're grown in the spring or the fall. Beets and carrots can be grown through the summer here, but if they're not watered well, they tend to make a disappointing harvest, and they may have harsh flavors. So that's something to bear in mind. Be sure that you can irrigate them and you have good, rich soil. When you're selecting plants for the summer garden, you want to think about disease resistance. Many of these are tropical plants that have brought along a whole array of tropical diseases that they're subject to. So you want to know that a particular variety that you're interested in is resistant to the common disease issues. That's particularly true in the case of tomatoes, and we'll talk about specifics. Productivity, I always think about, is this something that I can have plenty of fresh produce for the summer table, and is there something, a way to preserve any excess of produce for later use? And most of these things can be preserved at home rather easily. And then think about the fruit qualities that you're after. For example, you may want tomatoes that are in unconventional colors, something other than a standard red tomato. Or you may want purple hull beans because it's easy to see them on the vine and you don't miss any when you're picking them. So all of these things can be important considerations when you choose the individual varieties of these plants that you want to grow for the summer. So here's the ones we're going to be talking about. Beans of all kinds. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about lima beans, snap beans, French fillet beans. They all grow basically the same way. Tomatoes, the king of the summer garden around here. Sweet corn, cucurbits like cucumbers, zucchini, summer squash, and also the winter squashes and melons. And then sweet potatoes, okra, and peppers, both hot and sweet peppers. They're grown exactly the same way. So let's talk about beans. The old Farmer's Almanac method says to plant beans on Good Friday, which would have been a disaster this year because Easter was early and Good Friday was in March. The soil was very cold, so it's better to wait until the weather is settled and you'll have much better luck. Generally speaking, on the shelves, you can find where the bean seeds are on the same seed racks. You'll find little packets of legume inoculant. This is a really beneficial product that contains lots of live bacterial cells that you put into the planting hole when you plant the seeds. The bacteria then take up residence on the roots of the legume, on the beans, and that helps to fix nitrogen and helps the plants grow to the point that there is excess nitrogen left behind in the soil, which will benefit crops growing nearby or crops that are planted after you plant beans. Now, I live in a two-person household, and I have found that if you're talking about just for fresh beans to eat, let's say as a side dish, maybe 4 seeds planted every 2 weeks is going to give you a couple of handfuls of beans every week. If you're really crazy about beans, you may want to plant more than that. And if you plan on freezing or canning or otherwise preserving them, you'll want to plant more than that. But they're very productive. And I grow bush beans and just plant them in small amounts here and there in with other vegetables in the garden. Beans will tolerate a little bit of shade. They need about 6 hours of sun though, to produce well. And as we've said, pardon me, they require warmth. You can also grow pole beans rather than bush beans. The difference is that pole beans will produce continuously throughout the season from a single planting. The biggest drawback that I've found with pole beans is that they seem to be more susceptible to attack by Mexican bean beetles around here rather than as opposed to bush beans, which do get bean beetles, but not, it seems to me, as readily as pole bean varieties. But really the growing is exactly the same, except the pole beans need support. You can find all the same types of beans in both pole and bush varieties, generally speaking. Limas come that way. Filet beans, which are also called haricot vert, is a bean that is specially bred for fresh use only. They don't can very well. They don't freeze very well. Otherwise, they look like and grow like green beans, but you pick them when they're only about a quarter of an inch in diameter and young and tender, and they're very tasty, but they're for fresh use only. Then snap beans or green beans is the most common type of bean we have around here. And those come in a lot of different pod styles. For example, you can have wide, flat pods that we call those Italian style green beans. And then we have rounded, long pods intended for breaking and making snap beans. Those are often referred to as snap beans or just green beans. And then we also have all these various colors. Some are golden yellow pods, some have purple pods, and so forth. All of these grow the same way, and they're very, very reliable. There's an old saying that the ground is so poor it wouldn't grow beans. Beans will succeed where no other vegetable crop will grow in terms of soil fertility. Long as it's well drained and they get water and don't sit in soggy mud, you'll get some beans. The best way to preserve green beans and shelled lima beans is freezing, and you can find procedures for doing that in a number of different resources. The National Center for Home Food Preservation at the University of Georgia is an excellent resource on home canning and home freezing. And with the exception of the French style filet beans, all the preservation techniques, whether that be, you can also can beans, they have to be canned with a pressure canner, and you can also pickle green beans, and that's another good way to preserve them. You can find protocols for all of those things online. Probably the one crop that inexperienced gardeners ask me about growing most of all is sweet corn. And the only reply that I would say is applicable to every gardener is if you have the room. There is few homegrown vegetables that are as delicious as fresh sweet corn, but it does require room. Corn requires heat, sun, plenty of water, and rich soil, plenty of nitrogen. And yet you can only get 1 to 3 ears per stalk. Each stalk If it's a compact variety, will fit into about a square foot of space. If it's that would be for a space-saving type of corn. If it's an old standby like Iowa Chief or um, Silver Queen, those get quite large and take up considerably more than a square foot for each stalk. So it's worth remembering that it's a really good crop to grow, but you have to have enough space to make it worth your while. There are space-saving varieties, as I said. One of the oldest and most reliable for home gardens is Golden Bantam, that was developed by the Burpee Corporation. It makes a compact plant about 4 feet or so in height when they're mature, and each one produces 1 or 2 6-inch ears of corn. You can also grow the miniature corn that we see in Chinese food. That will grow in a relatively small space, and you just continuously pick the little baby corn. They never do get large and sweet like the standard sweet corn varieties. Any corn that is you're going to harvest for fresh eating, you wait until the silks turn brown. That's the first sign that the corn is mature. And then there's also the juice test. We carefully pull back the husk, take your thumbnail and crush a kernel, and if the sap that comes out is milky in color, that one is ready to eat. Now, it's important when it comes to this question of ready to eat to understand the sugar content designations of new varieties of corn. Heirloom corn varieties are called normal sugar, and this would be, for example, Silver Queen, which is a very, very famous old white sweet corn, very delicious heirloom. Those will retain sugar for about 3 days after they reach their peak, or only a couple of days after harvest. So the window for harvesting the traditional normal sugar varieties is about 3 to 5 days. Well, this was a problem for the fresh sales market, like farmers markets, where they aren't able to schedule things that tightly. And so we've seen market growers grow high sugar and super sweet varieties. One that's really popular, well, I can think of 2 or 3 different names. Ambrosia is one that we see around here quite a bit. Honey and Pearl is one that is also popular, that has both white and yellow kernels. These are corn types that have been modified, not GMO, but they have been bred in using normal plant breeding methods to increase the amount of sugar that is produced in the kernels. High sugar varieties have about twice the amount of sugar in the kernels as the old-fashioned normal sugar varieties. And super sweet varieties can have up to 4 times as much sugar in the kernels as the traditional varieties. What this means in terms of the consumer is that once the corn is picked and the sugar content starts to drop, the super sweet and high sugar corns have a lot longer shelf life. They'll remain sweet and palatable for a longer period of time than the normal sugar varieties. So,
John?
if you are growing corn.
John, we have a question. Do you have any methods for controlling brown marmorated stink bugs on corn?
Yeah, we can talk about that. Let me finish up here on the sugar thing, and then we'll talk about those stink bugs.
Sure.
The point I was going to make about sugar is that since you can go out into your backyard every day and check on the corn, and presumably you're going to harvest and eat it right then, you probably will be happier with the results you get from standard normal sugar varieties if you can find the seeds, which you typically have to get from heirloom seed dealers. Because I have actually, when I have grown honey and pearl and picked it under the normal circumstances, it's almost too sweet. So if you're going to try growing corn and you haven't done so previously, that's something worth bearing in mind. Now let's talk about those stink bugs. There's two insects that are kind of a problem in the garden, and they both look a lot alike. The brown marmorated stink bug looks an awful lot like squash bugs, which is another quote unquote true bug, meaning they have certain body features, and these things all have sucking mouth parts. They're related to aphids, mealybugs, adelgids, all of these critters with that suck plant juices. And in so doing, they also transfer viruses and bacteria that cause plant diseases. So this is a problem. One of the best ways that you can attack these without resorting to pesticide is trap them by leaving boards, cardboard or plywood, something like that, at the base of your plants on the soil. And this will provide a place for the insects to hide at night. And you go out there early in the morning, or even at night with a flashlight and sweep them off pick up the board, and the insects will be underneath, sweep them off into a bucket of soapy water. It is very difficult to come up with a pesticide that will actually kill these things, because they are taking their food directly from the interior of the plant. And unless you can get the pesticide into the plant, which obviously you don't want to do for something you're going to eat, it's kind of hard to deal with them. You can also try repellents. Neem oil, which is available at the organic controls area of the garden center. It comes from a tropical tree. It sort of smells like celery to me. You buy the concentrate and dilute it with water. I find that it won't kill squash bugs, but it will repel them. And it would probably, I haven't tried it on the marmorated stink bugs, but I'm betting that it will probably work there too. The only other thing you can do is pick them off by hand. A friend of mine has used a little handheld battery operated vacuum cleaner to suck up insects like that, and then you dump them out into a bucket of soapy water.
John, we've got another question.
All right.
Are there methods for dealing with chipmunks?
That's a toughie. Having a dog is probably one of the best ways to deal with pesky predators. But other than a specific trap, no, there's not a method other than either a no-kill trap or a kill type trap that I can think of to deal with rodents. Households with cats and small dogs probably would have fewer issues. Anything else before we move on?
That's all I have right now.
All righty. Some of my favorite summer vegetables are in this group, the cucurbits. let's say right up front that the biggest thing when you're growing these from transplants is to avoid disturbing the roots unnecessarily. They do not like that at all. And that's why, generally speaking, you'll see them offered in peat pots where you bury the entire pot in the ground. However, these things grow so fast that you can put seed in the ground now if you wish, and there's plenty of time for them to have a crop before midsummer. Generally speaking, most summer squash and cucumbers are ready in less than 2 months from germination. So you can be very comfortable direct seeding them. The seeds are large and easy to handle. They definitely need warmth and they definitely need sun. And if you can't provide 8 hours of full sun, I don't think I would even try them. Cucumber varieties and many varieties of squashes and melons will require a trellis. And in the case of the winter squashes and melons, if you trellis them, you're also going to have to tie up separately the fruits because they will get too large and will drop before they are well ripened. If you don't trellis melons and winter squashes, then I would suggest growing them on a bed of straw or using a plastic mulch underneath them to keep the fruits, let them sprawl on the ground, and that mulch will help keep the fruits clean and protect them from soil-borne organisms. All of these are greedy vegetables that need very organically rich, well-drained soil with well-balanced nutrients in there. And so they need the best area of the garden. If you don't want to provide support, there are plenty of summer squashes and zucchini that do not require a trellis, and there are a few so-called bush varieties of cucumbers that can be grown with at most something like a tomato cage for support. So if you don't want to put up a trellis, you can think about those. And again, you can let them scrawl around on the ground, but it's better to have a mulch rather than have soil for them to move around on. The biggest problem here are insects. We've already mentioned the squash bugs, which not only bother squashes and other vegetables, they will attack tomatoes and peppers as well. Squashes have their own special insect pests, squash borers, which is a native insect and is doesn't really have any natural predators in this, at least in this part of the world. These lay their eggs on the base of your squash leaves, on the stem of the squash leaf. And the larva, when it hatches out of the egg, burrows into the stem and eats its way out toward the leaf end of the stem. And that eventually kills the whole thing in the process, but not before the insect has had a chance to emerge and pupate in the soil and then have another generation. The only effective way to deal with these guys, and there's I should say also there's a cucumber borer that will bore into the fruits of the cucumber, and it also bores into the fruits of squashes. Really, the only way to deal with these, if you don't want to apply a chemical pesticide, is to keep the plants covered until they start to bloom. So from the time the plants emerge, or from the time you transplant them, until they start making blooms, you keep them covered with garden fleece or a fine nylon netting, something like that, that will physically exclude the flying adult insects that fly from plant to plant and lay their eggs and create these borer problems. Most organic pesticides are useless because the insects are inside the plant and protected by the plant itself, and so you can't get the chemical in where it's needed anyway. So that's a number one thing to keep in mind here is if you have this problem, if you have had problems in the past of squash borers, keeping the plants covered is your best protection. Now, the reason you have to remove the cover when the plants bloom is that these are insect pollinated. Beans are self-fertile, corn is pollinated by the wind, tomatoes and peppers can be pollinated either self-pollination or by insects, but cucumbers and squashes of all types require insect pollination, and they're difficult to pollinate artificially. So we have to, if we keep them covered, we still have to remove the cover to allow access to the flowers by pollinating insects like bees.
John, I have a question.
All right.
Someone wants to know if there is a companion plant that might deter the squash vine borers.
Not to my knowledge. It's a native moth, a day-flying native moth, and I'm not aware of certainly nothing that I've ever tried growing around, things like marigolds or members of the carrot family around plants doesn't seem to have any effect on the borers. They seem to be able to find your plants despite what you might be growing around. One thing that is possible is growing a trap crop. If you have a sufficient amount of space, you can plant one crop of, let's say, squashes some distance away from your vegetable garden and abandon those to the insects and hopefully keep them off your vegetables. There's some question, of course, as to whether that may not have the effect of just bringing in more potential threats. So I'll have to admit that the borers are one of the most confounding pests that we can have around here. Try to choose, I will say this, you'll have better luck growing rapidly maturing varieties and planting individual hills of seed about 2 weeks apart through the beginning of the growing season. And again, if you have the room to do that, that helps to work against the insects because there is a peak in the population of borers. There's 2 peaks per season here. And if you get your squash so that it's maturing in the trough between those 2 peaks, there won't be any borers to bother the squash at that time of year. The only way to hit that with any kind of accuracy is to do several plantings in succession in the hopes that one is going to give you an unmolested supply of squashes. Melons and winter squashes, because they take much longer to mature, are more susceptible to crop failure from borers than cucumbers and the summer squashes, which mature very rapidly. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And again, the problem with cucumber borers doesn't start showing up until high temperatures and low rainfall stress the plants out. The squash borers are out there about the time the squash is coming up. In any case, with these, once they start to produce, remove all the fruits regularly, and that will keep plants producing throughout the summer. They will stress if we have another period of time where we have 90 degrees for multiple days in a row. But a lot of times, if there's enough moisture, they'll come back and start bearing again after the temperature cools down. So keep harvesting and keep watering an inch a week, and that will keep your plants producing. They also, of course, require regular fertilization during during the summer, because again, you're going to have to supply quite a bit of water, and that's going to leach nutrients out of the soil. I would like to mention here, we've talked about fertilization. I always get asked what's the best fertilizer for plants, and it's usually the one that you happen to have on hand. If it's a good balanced fertilizer, whether it's organic or made up of inorganic components, you want those NPK numbers to be relatively the same, 10, 10, 10, 20, 20, 20, for all-purpose vegetable garden use. If you want to buy the specialty fertilizers that are made for particular plants, by all means, do that. I know tomato fertilizer is a popular one, has a higher amount of potassium. If that's your secret to good tomatoes, by all means, continue to do that. But you're going to need regular fertilization for the summer garden. And as a general rule, the more irrigation you have to supply, the more fertilization you're going to have to supply. Sweet potatoes are an excellent crop for this area because they love to grow in very warm conditions. They are grown from starts known as slips. And I'm going to move away from the screen share for just a second here and show you what my sweet potato slips look like. These are the Japanese purple sweet potatoes. And what I did to get to this point is about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, I took a sweet potato and cut the end off of it with several eyes still present on the end. If you look closely at one or the other end of the potato, you'll see little eyes on there. Cut that off about 2 inches and use toothpicks to hold. You take 3 toothpicks, put it around the perimeter of the potato so it will sit on top of a fruit jar that you've put some water in. This is exactly the way you start sweet potatoes for house plants, by the way. That used to be something that kids did in elementary school. Anyhow, if the bottom cut surface of the bottom of the potato is touching the water, it will start to grow, and it will start to make roots, and it will start to grow sprouts out from that potato. After those have grown for a few weeks, you will notice that the sprouts show signs of little roots developing down close to the original old potato root. That's the time that tells you that now you can break those sprouts off and put them in their own jar of water, and those roots will elongate. As you can see, these have nicely filled the jar. You keep those wet, and probably sometime this weekend I'll plant those outdoors. You can see, I'll take one out. There you can see what the finished product looks like. Sweet potatoes do not need particularly rich soil to grow in, but they do need soil that has a lot of organic matter and is well drained. What I have found, and I'm going to go back to screen sharing here. What I have found with them is that even though the soil, if the soil is too fertile, you will get a fewer number of large roots. If the soil is rather lean and not especially fertile, you will get a large number of smaller roots. And in my case, that's what I prefer. In either case, the produce will be usable, but I like smaller roots that can be roasted whole rather than large fruits that need to be peeled and cut up in order to cook them.
John, I have
You
a
can,
couple of questions or before you
okay.
move on. Someone wants to know if they buy sweet potatoes from the grocery store to make slips, do they need to be organic? He said he's had better luck with organic sweet potatoes.
I would do that. Yes, these came from Three Rivers Market and are from organic Japanese purple sweet potatoes. And one of the reasons for that too is if you plan to grow with organic fertilization, it's better to derive seeds and starts from plants that have previously been grown organically, since they're a little better adapted to organic culture.
Okay.
But yes, I would always, if I'm going to start them that way, I would buy organic sweet potatoes. It is not too late to start the slips. I got mine going because I wanted to have them ready for mid-May to late May planting. But you can start them now from stored, sweet potato tubers from the grocery store. You can go ahead and start them now and still have time. Once they're large enough to plant in the ground, there'll still be plenty of time for them to bear before it frosts in the fall.
Okay, I've got one other question, John. Wants to know if you can start rosemary from a cutting similar to what you just described for the sweet potato. In other words, put the cutting in water.
Yes, you can start most of your perennial herbs that have woody stems just by rooting in water. However, it is easier, in my opinion, you get more reliable results if you go ahead and make a little pot of potting soil and dip your cutting in rooting hormone powder, stick it in the potting soil, keep that nice and moist. It'll probably root better and make you a better, healthier plant. But in the absence of rooting hormone or wanting to fool with that, you can start all of the perennial herbs: rosemary, sage, parsley, mint, oregano, thyme, from either cuttings from friends, or you can buy a bunch from the grocery store if you happen to catch them. Unpacking them is the ideal time, and you can start your own plants from those just by rooting them in a glass of water.
Okay, John, I got one more question came up here. Will red garnets grow here?
Red garnet sweet potatoes?
I suppose so, that they just have red garnets.
Yeah, they're all the same basic plant. So yes, I wouldn't. I'm fond of the white fleshed sweet potatoes that you occasionally find in the markets, and I've grown them that way. Standard orange sweet potatoes, and I believe the red garnet is in that family as well. And then the ones I have here are Japanese purple sweet potatoes that I've never grown before, and they are behaving exactly like all the other varieties that I've tried over the years. So I would say, yes, you should be able to grow any of them by that same method. If you're going to get roots from the grocery store, look carefully and see if any have already begun to sprout. This is the time of year where they would naturally begin to sprout. They've probably been stored in cold storage and brought out then in the grocery store into the normal room temperature. After a few weeks, they'll start to sprout. So those would be the ideal ones to select for starting slips. Okay, let's move on to okra. This is probably the most controversial vegetable out there. Everybody I know either despises okra or thinks it's the one of the greatest vegetables there is. You can start okra in small pots and transplant it, but it's just about as easy to direct seed because the seeds are about the size of a BB and they're easy to separate out by the necessary spacing. This is another one that you want to wait until the soil is good and warm, but they're not fussy about soil. They'll even grow on heavy clay soils. Okra is not bothered by insects, and once they start to bear, uh, they bear continuously until frost if you harvest regularly. If you allow one or two pods to mature on the plant, it'll stop blooming. Now, there are a lot of different okra varieties that are out there. One of my favorites that I've grown probably more seasons than any other one is Clemson Spineless. And the reason for my preference is that spineless part, because harvesting okra can be a real adventure if you happen to be sensitive to the little spines that cover the surface of the leaves and the fruits and other parts of the plant. Some people find them extremely irritating. I find them mildly irritating. And Clemson Spineless is a variety that was developed not to have that problem. If you're not worried about the spines, I would go with some of the heirloom varieties. There's one called Cowhorn that makes very large pods that still retain their tenderness. The fact that you need to harvest frequently, generally, if you can't have at least 8 plants, it's very hard to get enough pods to make a worthwhile harvest. They only keep about 3 days in the refrigerator. So if you have 8 plants and you only harvest 1 or 2 pods off of each plant every 2 days, that's about the minimum amount that you would want. So given that there has to be plenty of room around them so that you can get in there and harvest, okra does take up more room than a lot of other summer vegetables. But if you're like me and you really like okra, then it's worth devoting the time and space to do it. Okra is also exceptionally easy to preserve. All you have to do to freeze it is wipe the soil off the pods, if any, and drop them in freezer containers and freeze them. You do it whole and cut them up later, or you can cut them up as you would for cooking and freeze it that way. But there's no special treatment necessarily necessary for okra. You just freeze the pods. There are several varieties of okra. One I can think of, Annie Oakley, that produces a red streaked pod. They taste the same. The purpose of the red pod is so you won't miss any when you're harvesting, and thereby sort of turn off the productivity for the plant. So you can have fun with seed catalogs with okra, or have fun scanning the seed rack for these different types that are out there. But again, if you're looking for a compact grower that doesn't have the itchy spines, Clemson Spineless is a pretty foolproof variety. Peppers is one of the tomato family, and one of the main vegetables that I have always found transplants to give better results than trying to grow them in place. And the reason for that is germination is quite spotty in some types of peppers. And so it's better to plant more cells for plants than you would grow, and then take the ones that actually do germinate, or when they germinate, they make non-deformed plants, and start with those. You can also purchase pepper starts at most garden centers. And unlike the tomatoes, they do tend to come out later in the season. If you buy peppers a little too early and they're starting to get root bound in the nursery container, you can always pot them up to a larger container. If you have a container and some potting soil and they're starting to get root bound, you can go ahead and pot them up to a larger container indoors, and they will get along better that way than if you let them totally pot that. Again, peppers need warmth and sun, and I have found that the hot peppers do better with heat, with atmospheric heat than sweet peppers do. The soil is ideally for peppers about the same as for tomatoes. It needs to be well drained and moderately fertile. It doesn't have to be exceptionally rich. Slight soil acidity is important. Lime and ashes, wood ashes, you would want to stay away from where you are planning on growing peppers and tomatoes. Peppers don't seem to be particularly bothered with insects. There's certainly things that will get on there and chew on them from time to time, I suppose. But frequently, you can go the whole season and not have any insect problems with peppers.
Can you hear them?
We got a question?
Did someone have a question or unmute?
Okay.
John, I do have a question while we
Okay.
thought there. It's a little off topic, but not much. What about controlling mint that you've already planted in the ground and trying to, she said she's been trying to pull it out by the roots, but it keeps coming back. So any suggestions about that?
You could try covering with black plastic, especially if the area gets sun and you can cook it out of the soil. But if it's established and that isn't feasible, about the only other thing I can think of that's 100% is Roundup. If it's growing that well, it's got enough moisture and so on, and mint doesn't really need fertile soil, so it'll grow in less than ideal conditions. Being absolutely vigilant with pulling it would be the only other suggestion I could make. It's not easy to eradicate.
Okay, thanks, John.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, on the peppers, allow plenty of time for the fruits to mature. Generally speaking, when you look in the seed catalog and it says 80 days to maturity, that's to the green pepper stage from the time you transplant the plant into the garden. By the time you have put the plant into the garden, it's already 30 days old, and it takes a week or two for pepper seeds to germinate. So if you're going to start them yourself from seed, you want to start them in April or May so that they're ready to go out by late May, early June. If you're growing peppers in groups, grow close enough together that the leaves barely touch when they are fully grown. That way, they will keep high humidity around the plants without being so close that it inhibits air circulation around the plants. And with other fruiting plants, especially if you're wanting green peppers, harvest them frequently to keep the plants producing. California Wonder is probably the most popular green pepper variety that's grown around here, but there are literally hundreds of them, and there's an equal number of hot ones. I don't grow hot peppers anymore because my digestive system doesn't like them, and even though I still do, but they are grown the same way as sweet peppers. You can find compact ones that are intended for small space cultivation. Lunchbox is a good one that makes lots and lots and lots and lots of little sweet peppers that are either orange or red or yellow when they mature, one color for each plant. So you can grow multiples of those. Also, the old-fashioned banana peppers, which are very much more like peppers that originally grew in the wild, they are also easy and forgiving and will produce large quantities of fruit for use in the kitchen.
John, we have a question actually related to that.
All right.
The question is, how many peppers can we typically expect per plant? It seems mine have not provided heavy yields, maybe 3 to 4 peppers per plant per season.
that would cause me to suspect we're growing big sweet bell peppers. And they're highly pedigreed, and that level of productivity might be, depending on the variety, that might be normal. If you're looking for large numbers of fruits, go with the smaller fruited varieties, either uh, hot peppers that have small fruits, or something like Lunchbox. There's a couple of others that will have many, many, many more individual fruits. Uh, in the whole scheme of peppers generally, the uh, big red sweet bell peppers that we see in the grocery store that are generally imported in from Mexico are the hardest to reproduce in your backyard garden. They're fussy and highly inbred and need your very best attention in order for them to produce well. And of course, they need 8 hours of sun and plenty of water. So I would say maybe getting 6 to 8 fruits per plant is probably good for some varieties. But if you're only getting 6 to 8 fruits from an old-fashioned sweet banana pepper, then the soil probably not fertile enough for them. Even though they need nutrition, even though they don't need it the same way cucumbers do.
Okay, John, we've got to back up just a minute to talk about
Okay.
sweet potatoes.
Okay.
The statement, my sweet potato plants usually produce large amounts of leaves. Should some leaves be removed to direct more energy to the roots?
I don't find that necessary. It was never a practice traditionally when I was growing up, but sweet potato leaves can be eaten as cooked greens or added to salads if they're small and tender, and there's no harm in removing leaves. But I don't know that you might want to resort to that if you felt like the soil was unusually fertile and you were headed for large, gigantic, oversized roots. But I don't know of any recommendation that you would be required to remove leaves. It sure won't hurt them. They're very vigorous plants. Anything else?
That's it for right now.
Okay. And I saved my favorite, what I think is everybody's favorite, maybe, to last, which is tomatoes. Everything we said about growing peppers, we can say about tomatoes, except they're not as fond of high temperatures. When the temperature is above about 90, tomatoes fail to pollinate, and that reduces your fruit production dramatically. They need slightly acid, moisture retaining soil with plenty of organic matter. And the biggest issue with tomatoes, which again, generally we grow them all from transplants, and you can either purchase transplants at the garden center or start them indoors yourself, is disease resistance. Tomatoes are subject to several different types of foliar diseases, fusarium wilt and alternaria blight are the two most common. They have early blight, late blight, and fusarium. All of these are fungal diseases that are transmitted from spores that live in the soil, and it's very difficult after the fact to cure a plant once the foliage has developed the symptoms of these diseases. So the best approach is, number one, look for varieties that have resistance, and that will be indicated by an F or a V or an N, or maybe all three, after the name of the variety on the seed packet. So let's take a common hybrid tomato as Big Boy. That'll be Big Boy VFN hybrid, or Big Boy hybrid VFN is what it will say on the label. And that VFN tells you that it's has resistance to verticillium, fusarium, and nematodes. The nematodes aren't such a problem around here, but the other two are, and that would be a plus for growing that tomato variety. These days, many people are interested in growing heirloom tomatoes like Cherokee Purple, which has become, you might almost say, a beloved tomato variety in this area because it was actually developed in this part of the country by indigenous people and was passed along ultimately to the Europeans that came here. So, and they're quite tasty. If you want to grow those, you're going to have to take steps to prevent them from developing these fungal diseases. And the two main things to do there is, one is avoid wetting the foliage. If you irrigate, water the soil with a hose. Do not use an overhead type sprinkler to irrigate your tomatoes because that wets the foliage every time. And use a thick mulch over the soil as soon as you have transplanted the plants. As soon as you put those tomato plants in the ground, mulch around them with a good layer of straw or some other organic mulch to protect the leaves from soil splattering up when it rains or when you apply irrigation water. That will go a long way toward protecting your plants from these fungal diseases. You may still get fungal diseases on the plants. If you see spots, yellow spots, or unusual leaf coloration, you can go online and look for similar patterns and decide what type of disease is bothering your plants. But the treatment is generally going to be the same for all of them. Remove that diseased foliage and destroy it, and improve your culture methods so that, again, maybe you need to add mulch. You're getting soil splattered on the leaves, or maybe you're wetting the foliage too frequently. In some seasons, the plants get too much water, or water in an uneven pattern, what you would call boom and bust. They go from being drenched one day to being bone dry the next. And this sometimes happens, for example, when summers are really hot, the way they are here, so that the ground dries out rapidly between events of irrigation. This will almost always lead to blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is actually a calcium deficiency, but it's usually precipitated by uneven watering. The plants go for a period of time with no water, and then they get a lot of water. This also can cause fruit to crack if it happens during the time that the plants are fruiting. The sudden arrival of rain or irrigation will cause the fruit to crack. So the main point that I would make is, if the plants are growing in the ground or in raised beds, do not water unless the soil is actually showing signs that it's beginning to dry out on the surface. Stick your fingers down below the mulch and see if the soil down there is still moist. If it's not beginning to dry out, don't worry too much about watering the plants. On the other hand, if they're in containers or they're on raised beds where there's perhaps a greater tendency for the soil to dry out, you want to make sure that you check regularly so that they don't go through a period of drought and then all of a sudden there's abundant water, because that will almost always ruin some of the fruits. Tomatoes need strong support. And one thing I've learned over the years, if you read in the seed catalog that the plants get 5 feet tall, here in the Tennessee Valley, those same plants will get 7 feet tall. The tomatoes need cages or staking or some form of trellis that will support plants that get typically at least 6 feet in height and have these abundance of 10 to 16 ounce fruits on there. If the trellis isn't sufficient, the whole thing is going to tip over and you're going to lose a lot of produce. So be sure that your tomatoes are well supported. The wire cages that they sell everywhere for tomatoes, I have found only the largest ones are worth buying, and those are best for your indeterminate type tomatoes, the tomatoes that stay short and stocky. I might mention, in case people aren't aware, tomatoes have two basic growth patterns. Determinate tomatoes grow to a certain size and then stop. Indeterminate tomatoes keep growing all season long. Most of the heirloom tomatoes that everybody wants to grow are indeterminate, and they can get really, really large and need adequate trellising, or you can cut the main stem and let them branch, depending on the amount of room that you have. But those are definitely going to need support, and it's going to have to be something other than just a wire tomato cage. You can go online and find many different ideas for supporting your tomatoes.
John,
Generally speaking, yes.
we have a question. Is
Okay.
creating a raised bed with soil we control a better choice than clearing a space and tilling an area in the backyard lawn to get results from tomatoes and peppers in Knoxville? The backyard soil is very different here than where I used to live in Zone 5. So raised bed versus tilling a place up in the yard.
I would have, the answer depends on the nature of the soil that's already in the yard. I would have a soil test done, and if, like my neighbors across the street, new neighbors just moved in and want to re-landscape the front of the house, and the first thing they did was have a soil test done. Soil test indicated that there was very low fertility. That would tell you that you'd be better off adding fresh new soil than you would be trying to raise the fertility of using things like manure, which has to break down, or using chemical fertilizer or something of that nature. To give a general answer, if the soil you have in your garden spot is already well drained, high in organic matter, and has good fertility based on the soil test, then you're going to be better off growing your plants in the ground. The main reason to have a raised bed is where the existing soil is, for example, like the soil around my house was. I live in a subdivision. The house was built in the late 1990s. And back then, what they did was scrape all the topsoil off into a pile. And then while construction was going on, they're rolling tractor vehicles around on the clay and really compacting the clay. And then they spread that topsoil back around in different areas. Some places it's thick, some places it's thin. So as a general rule, the soil around my house isn't, without significant amendments, isn't satisfactory for vegetables. I like to tell people that vegetables are the most fussy of any of the plants that we normally grow as part of our landscape. Trees and shrubs and most of our popular perennials do not need nearly as much nutrition or intensive care that vegetables need. So you want to give your vegetables always the very best soil in the yard. And if the existing soil is not in good shape, it's easier and faster to build a raised bed and bring in soil. You can improve the existing soil by tilling in amendments of various kinds, but that's a multi-year process. So if you're wanting to get up and growing this year, you're probably going to be better off building a raised bed and filling it with new topsoil from from a supplier. Other questions?
That's all for right now.
The only thing on the tomatoes that I hadn't mentioned is feeding them. They're not as hungry as peppers and some of the other summer vegetables. I like to give them a good feeding, say a week after transplanting. Give them a chance to recover from being transplanted, and then apply fertilizer. Then about every 2 or 3 weeks, maybe, and then again give them a good dose when the blooms appear. UT Agriculture Institute did some research a number of years ago that showed that giving tomatoes a boost of nitrogen when they start to bloom improves the crop. That goes against the traditional notion that feeding tomatoes with a high potassium diet encourages fruiting. It turns out that if you feed them nitrogen when the blooms show, that will improve your crop. Tomatoes, of course, are easy to preserve. I would say the number one way that they're preserved traditionally around here is canning, home canning, but you can also drop whole tomatoes into freezer bags and freeze them. And then when you take them out and thaw them out, it's very easy to separate the skins from the rest of the tomatoes. And you can use those in things like pasta sauce or salsa. Obviously, they'll be mushy and you can't use them on a sandwich, but you can use them for just about any cooked dish. I would encourage you to start with disease-resistant varieties if this is the first year that you're growing tomatoes. And once you get the hang of growing tomatoes, then branch out and grow some of the exotic ones like Cherokee Purple and Black Krim and Russian Princess and so forth. I will mention that if you're interested, you can go to Tomato Fest, one word, TOMATOFEST.com, and learn about dwarf tomatoes, which are being developed mostly by volunteers, gardener, backyard growers, just like all of us, who are after plants that stay small, under 4 feet in height, but nevertheless produce standard to salad size to standard slicer size fruits. There's only a limited number of these available now, but hopefully we'll have more varieties in the future. I'm trying 4 different ones this year to see how they do for me. But if you're that's an area to branch out in. But if this is your first year, stick with things like Better Boy or the Husky series if you're interested in determinate type tomatoes. Thank you very much. We'll take some additional time for questions. I'm going to take a moment here to plug my latest book, which has a lot of the stuff that I've just gone over and more. And it's available at Union Avenue Books or online from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And we'll hang around here for more questions if you will, if anyone has them.
If anybody has any questions, just type them out or go ahead and unmute at this point. But before I do that, I'll just tell you that we are recording this and it'll be posted hopefully on our YouTube website, our YouTube channel next week. And there's one question about basil.
Yes, I saw that one. I saw that one skip by. And yes, ma'am, you planted too early. Replant. Basil does not like cool weather at all. And in fact, if the temperature goes much below 40, the leaves will turn black overnight. So yes, replant and you should be fine. It's just not been happy with the weather up now. Thank you everyone for all the kind comments that you're sharing here through the chats. I'm seeing them all. as they come across. There's Holly sharing the YouTube link.
Yeah, that's someone had asked about where it is. So there's the YouTube link. There are other classes out there already that we've been doing. So, but like I said, there are more to come. So if nobody else has any questions, we'll sign off now. Thank you again, John. I
It
know
was
I always learn a lot.
Could you show the
my pleasure, and I'll hopefully
YouTube link?
we'll be doing some other classes as the season progresses. So thanks everyone for being here today. Oh, I will mention you can email Knox Garden Talk, all one word, KNOX Garden Talk @gmail.com. Anytime you have a question for me, I check that email account 2 or 3 times a week. And if you send a question, I will be very happy to, if I don't know the answer, I will try to get the answer and get the information for you. So
Great. All right.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.